All right, today we're tackling one of the most complicated figures of the American Revolution, General Horatio Gates. I mean, this is a guy whose name is tied to one of the biggest wins and one of the most embarrassing losses of the whole war. How does that even happen?
Yeah, let's really get into this because it's such a wild story. He was the guy in charge at Saratoga, the battle that basically saved the entire revolution. So how on earth does a man with that on his resume end up remembered as a total failure? It just doesn't add up.
And this really just spells it all out, doesn't it? The contrast is just stark. You've got Saratoga in '77, the absolute turning point of the war, the win that got France on our side. Gates is a national hero. Fast forward just 3 years, you get Camden, a complete and utter disaster. His army gets wiped out and he personally runs away from the fight. I mean, talk about hero to zero. It's almost unbelievable.
So, to figure out this whole conundrum, how one person can be both the hero and the goat, we've got to dig a little deeper. We need to look at the man himself, not just the battles.
And here's the thing you might not know. Before all the battlefield fame or infamy, Horatio Gates was known for something completely different. He was a paperwork guy, an administrator. And not just any administrator. He was seen as a genius at it. George Washington's go-to guy, the one he couldn't do without.
So his story actually starts in the British Army. He was an officer, and he even served alongside a young George Washington during the French and Indian War. But you know how it is. Peacetime army, promotions are slow. He got frustrated, sold his commission, and moved to Virginia to become a planter. But then, boom, the revolution kicks off. And suddenly, a guy with his kind of military experience is pure gold. Congress snatches him up and makes him the Continental Army's very first adjutant general. Basically, he's the guy in charge of making the army actually work.
And man, was he good at it. You have to remember, this new army was a total mess. The adjutant general had to handle everything: organization, training, paperwork, intelligence, the whole shebang. Gates came in and brought order to that chaos. He was so good, in fact, that Washington himself said he looked around and couldn't find a single other person who could do the job as well as Gates.
But here's the catch. Gates was super ambitious. Being the best number 2 in the army wasn't enough for him. He wanted the top spot. He wanted the glory. So he started playing politics, maneuvering behind the scenes, and eventually he got what he wanted. An independent command of his own, up in the Northern Department. And this is where he would have his finest hour.
Now, when he got up there, the army he inherited was a complete wreck. It was, in his own words, in a deplorable state. Guys were dying, deserting, getting sick. It was bad. But this is where his real talent shined. He put that administrative genius to work, reorganizing everything, getting supplies flowing, and totally turning things around. One historian said he just electrified the morale of the entire army.
And that perfect setup led right into the Saratoga campaign. His newly energized army was ready. First, they stopped the British invasion cold in its tracks. Then, even though he was having this massive, bitter fight with his star field commander, Benedict Arnold, and that's a whole other story, the Americans pulled off a huge, decisive victory. And then came the moment, October 17, 1777. The British General John Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to Horatio Gates. Just imagine that.
I really want you to understand how huge this was. This wasn't just another battle. Saratoga is considered the turning point of the whole war. This single victory convinced France, who was on the fence, that, hey, these Americans might actually pull this off. And that's when they jumped in, giving us the money, the soldiers, and the navy we desperately needed. Without Saratoga, there's no French alliance. And without the French, there's probably no victory at Yorktown. It's that important.
So at this exact moment, Horatio Gates is the biggest hero in America. He's on top of the world. Congress is singing his praises. They give him a gold medal. They call him the hero of Saratoga. This is it, the absolute high point of his entire life.
And of course, this is right where the story takes a nosedive. That same ambition that pushed him to the top, well, it was about to become his fatal flaw. It's going to lead to backroom deals, conspiracy, and, in the end, total catastrophe.
Okay, so to get what happens next, you have to picture the scene in late 1777. You've got General Gates, the hero, being celebrated everywhere for his amazing victory. At the exact same time, what's happening with Washington's army? They're losing. They're getting beat at Brandywine, beat at Germantown, and they're stumbling into that infamous, brutal winter at Valley Forge. This difference was pretty obvious to everyone, especially some folks in Congress and in the army.
And that contrast led to something we now call the Conway cabal. It was basically this shady, behind-the-scenes plot by a handful of officers and politicians who were thinking, hey, maybe Washington isn't the guy for the job. They wanted him out, and who was the obvious replacement? The hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates. Now, how much Gates was actually involved is still debated, but one thing's for sure, he didn't do anything to stop the whispers. Washington found out and was absolutely livid. He saw it as Gates trying to climb over him to the top. The plot fizzled out, but it completely poisoned the well between Washington and Gates forever.
All right, so that brings us to the final disastrous chapter. Gates is still craving another big win, another moment in the spotlight. He pushes Congress hard for another top command, and in 1780, he gets it. They put him in charge of the Southern Department. The mission? Go down there and save the American cause, which was really struggling. Instead of saving it, he pretty much lit it on fire.
So Gates marches his army down to South Carolina to face off against the British, led by Lord Cornwallis. And look at these numbers. He has almost twice as many men. About 4,000 Americans to just over 2,000 British. On paper, this should have been a walk in the park. He had this thing in the bag, or so you'd think.
But then he makes just a classic, textbook fatal mistake. The military playbook says you put your strongest, most reliable troops on your right flank, your post of honor. So Gates does that. But what does that mean for his left flank? It means that's where he stuck his weakest, most inexperienced militia. And who were they facing? Only the absolute best, most hardened, professional soldiers in the entire British Army. You can't make that mistake. It was a complete recipe for disaster.
And yep, disaster is exactly what he got. The second those British regulars started marching forward with their bayonets fixed, that American militia on the left just broke. They panicked. They literally threw down their guns and ran for their lives, most of them without even firing a shot. This quote from an eyewitness says it all. It was instantaneous. The whole flank just evaporated.
So the flank collapsing was a disaster for sure. But what the commanding general, Horatio Gates, did next, that's what sealed his fate in the history books forever.
60 miles. That's the number you need to remember. While what was left of his army, the tough Continental regulars, were still fighting and dying bravely on the field, their commander-in-chief, Horatio Gates, jumped on the fastest horse he could find and took off. He didn't just retreat, he fled. He rode a mind-boggling 60 miles away from the battle, on the very first day.
And he didn't stop there. In 3 days, he was 200 miles away. He had completely abandoned his army. You can just imagine the reaction from the other officers. They were horrified. Alexander Hamilton pretty much summed it up for everyone. Was there ever an instance of a general running away from his whole army? It was just unthinkable. It was a disgrace.
The consequences were, well, catastrophic. The entire American army in the South was just gone, wiped out. Gates was, of course, immediately fired. His military career was over, just like that. And to make things worse, he later gets tangled up in another shady affair, the Newburgh Conspiracy, which was basically a potential military coup against Congress. So, the great hero of Saratoga? Yeah, his reputation was completely and totally in ruins.
Which brings us right back to where we started. How in the world are we supposed to make sense of this guy's legacy?
So what's the verdict? Was he a genuine hero and a brilliant organizer who just had one spectacularly bad day at Camden? Or was Saratoga a fluke? Was he just an ambitious political player who was in over his head and finally got exposed? Was it all just about his ambition getting the better of him?
You know, when you really boil it down for all of his failures, and they were massive failures, you just can't erase Saratoga. His politicking was questionable, Camden was a catastrophe, but that one victory he commanded was absolutely essential. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. No Saratoga, no French alliance. No French alliance, no victory at Yorktown. No American independence. It's a direct line.
And maybe the most fascinating and kind of tragic part of this whole story is this one quote. It's from a letter Gates wrote to his son right after his huge win at Saratoga. He tells his son basically, don't get a big head about this victory. Life has its ups and its downs, and we have to try and handle both with a level head. It's just so ironic, isn't it? He understood the lesson perfectly, but it's a lesson his own ambition just wouldn't let him live by. A really powerful reminder of just how razor-thin the line between being a hero and a failure can truly be.